Venezuela's sub got too close to a US carrier, and the real story is far more dangerous than you think.
Let me take you back to July 17, 2024.
The USS Harry S. Truman, one of the most advanced nuclear-powered aircraft carriers in the world, was conducting routine exercises in the Caribbean routine, that is, until a Venezuelan diesel-electric submarine surfaced within visual range of the carrier's strike group. The Pentagon called it a provocative and unprofessional act. The media ran with headlines about Maduro's reckless gamble.
And just like that, the story vanished from the news cycle, dismissed as another bizarre episode in Venezuela's long descent into chaos. But here's the I've spent the last 3 decades studying naval posturing, great power competition, and the unspoken rules of escalation in the Western Hemisphere. And what happened that day wasn't just a random act of Venezuelan bravado. It was a calculated signal, one that Washington doesn't want you to fully understand, because if you did, you'd realize we're standing at the edge of a geopolitical fault line that could rupture with far greater consequences than most analysts are willing to admit. Let me tell you what's really going on. The official what they want you to believe.
According to the Pentagon's official statement, the Venezuelan submarine, a Russian-built Kilo-class vessel, the Sabalo, violated international norms by approaching within 12 nautical miles of the Truman strike group.
The U.S. Southern Command called it a clear escalation and warned that such actions threaten regional stability.
The State Department followed up with a statement condemning Venezuela's destabilizing behavior, while Senator Marco Rubio took to X to demand a strong response to Maduro's aggression. The media, as it often does, amplified the alarm.
CNN ran a segment on how Venezuela's military is becoming a proxy for Russia and China.
The Wall Street Journal published an op-ed arguing that Maduro is testing Biden's resolve. And within 48 hours, the story was buried under the latest Trump indictment or Taylor Swift drama, as if the incident were just another footnote in the slow-motion collapse of a failed state.
But there's a problem with this narrative. A big one. First, the Kilo-class submarine is not some cutting-edge stealth platform.
It's a 1980s-era diesel sub, slow, noisy by modern standards, and detectable by U.S. anti-submarine warfare assets long before it gets within 20 miles of a carrier. The idea that it snuck up on the Truman is laughable to anyone who understands naval warfare. The U.S. Navy has spent billions developing sonar arrays, P-8 Poseidon patrol aircraft, and underwater drone networks specifically to hunt these kinds of submarines. If a Kilo got that close, it wasn't because the U.S. was caught off guard, it was because someone wanted it to get that close.
Second, Venezuela's navy is a shadow of what it once was. Sanctions, brain drain, and corruption have gutted its operational capacity. The Sabalo itself is over 30 years old, and its crew, while competent, isn't exactly the elite force of a near-peer competitor. So why would Maduro risk his most valuable naval asset in such a high-stakes game of chicken? Third, and most importantly, the U.S. has known about this submarine's movements for days. The Truman Strike Group wasn't operating in a vacuum, it was surrounded by a network of satellites, reconnaissance drones, and allied naval forces. The idea that a single Venezuelan sub could sneak up on it is about as plausible as a rowboat ambushing an aircraft carrier. So what's really happening here? Deconstructing the hidden what the data and the silence reveals. Let's start with the timing. The Sabalo's approach didn't happen in a vacuum.
It came just days after the U.S. announced it was reimposing oil sanctions on Venezuela, reversing a brief détente that had allowed Chevron and other American firms to resume limited operations in the country. It also followed a series of high-level meetings between Venezuelan and Russian officials, including a visit by Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov to Caracas in early July.
Now, here's where it gets interesting. According to intelligence sources I've spoken with, the Sabalo wasn't acting alone.
It was escorted by a Russian Navy Yazan-class nuclear submarine, the Kazan, which had been operating in the Caribbean since late June. The Kazan is one of Russia's most advanced attack subs, capable of launching hypersonic missiles and evading U.S. detection.
And it didn't surface.
It stayed submerged, lurking just outside the Truman's ASW perimeter, ready to intervene if the U.S. decided to engage the Sabalo.
This changes everything. Because what we're looking at isn't just a Venezuelan provocation, it's a coordinated Russian-Venezuelan operation, designed to test U.S. responses in America's own backyard. But why now?
Why take this risk?
The answer lies in three: oil, sanctions, and multipolarity.
Venezuela sits on the world's largest proven oil reserves, more than Saudi Arabia. For years, the U.S. has tried to strangle Maduro's regime with sanctions, hoping to force a political transition. But here's those sanctions haven't worked. Venezuela has pivoted to China and Russia, selling oil at a discount in exchange for military and economic support.
And now, with global energy markets tightening, the U.S. is facing a dilemma. If it wants to keep oil prices stable, it needs Venezuelan crude back on the market. But if it eases sanctions, it emboldens Maduro, and by extension, Moscow and Beijing. The Sabalo incident was a "we're not going anywhere. And if you push us, we have friends who can push back." And that's where the Kaizen comes in. Russia isn't just propping up Maduro out of ideological solidarity. It's doing it because the Caribbean is strategic real estate. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union tried to establish a naval base in Cuba. Today, Russia is playing a longer game. It's not about building bases, it's about denial. By demonstrating that it can operate submarines in the U.S.'s near abroad, Russia is signaling that it can disrupt American power projection in the event of a crisis, whether in Venezuela, Cuba, or even the Gulf of Mexico. China, meanwhile, is watching closely. Beijing has been quietly extending its presence in the Caribbean, funding port projects in AMA and the Bahamas, and increasing its naval patrols in the region. The Sabalo incident wasn't just a Venezuelan-Russian operation, it was a trial run for what a Sino-Russian axis in America's hemisphere might look like. And the US? It's stuck in a trap of its own making. The extant geopolitical how this fits into the new Cold War. Let me be what we're witnessing isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the end of American unipolarity and the return of great power competition in the Western Hemisphere, a region the U.S. has long considered its exclusive sphere of influence. For decades, the U.S. operated under the assumption that it could dictate terms in Latin America. The Monroe Doctrine, the Roosevelt Corollary, the Cold War interventions all were based on the idea that no external power could challenge American dominance in the region. But that era is over. Russia and China are no longer content to let the U.S. call the shots. And Venezuela, desperate for allies, has become the perfect proxy for their ambitions. This is where the hypocrisy of U.S. foreign policy becomes glaring. When Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, the U.S. condemned it as a violation of international law. When China built artificial islands in the South China Sea, the U.S. sent warships to challenge its excessive maritime claims. But when the U.S. itself has intervened in Latin America, overthrowing governments in Guatemala, Chile, and AMA, invading Grenada and AMA, supporting coups in Honduras and Bolivia, it's framed as promoting democracy or protecting national security. The double standard is so obvious that even U.S. allies are starting to notice. Mexico's president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, has openly criticized U.S. interference in Latin America. Brazil's Lula da Silva has called for a new non-aligned movement in the region. And Argentina's Javier Milei, despite his pro-US rhetoric, has refused to break ties with China or Russia. This is the real geopolitical. The US is no longer the only game in town. And Venezuela is the test case for what happens when a small country decides to play the great powers off each other. Now, let's talk about the military implications, because this is where things get dangerous. Military and strategic, why this could spiral out of control. The Truman Strike Group wasn't just on a routine patrol. It was part of a deliberate show of force. The U.S. has been rotating carrier groups through the Caribbean since 2022, a response to growing Russian and Chinese activity in the region. But here's the: carrier strike groups are not invincible. They're vulnerable to submarines, hypersonic missiles, and swarming drone attacks. The Sabalo incident was a low-cost, high-impact demonstration of that vulnerability. By getting that close, Venezuela, and by extension, Russia, was sending a "we can reach you. And if you escalate, we have options." Now, let's talk about those options. 1. Submarine warfare. The Kilo class is old, but it's still deadly. In 2015, a Russian Kilo in the Mediterranean sank a U.S. carrier in a wargame. In 2022, a Chinese Yuan-class subsurfaced within torpedo range of a U.S. destroyer in the South China Sea.
The U.S. Navy's ASW capabilities are the best in the world, but they're not perfect.
And in a real conflict, even a single torpedo hit on a carrier could be catastrophic. 2. Hypersonic missiles. Russia's Kazan is armed with Zircon hypersonic missiles, which travel at Mach 9 and are nearly impossible to intercept.
If Russia were to deploy these in the Caribbean, it would force the U.S. to rethink its entire naval posture in the region. 3. Electronic warfare. Russia has been testing advanced EW systems in Venezuela, including the Krasuka 4, which can jam U.S. radar and communications. In a conflict, this could blind American forces, making it nearly impossible to coordinate a response. 4. Proxy forces. Venezuela has been training with Iranian-backed militias and Russian Wagner Group operatives. If the U.S. were to launch a strike on Venezuela, it could face asymmetric retaliation not just from Venezuela, but from Hezbollah cells in Latin America, or even cyber attacks from Russian or Chinese hackers. And here's the U.S. knows this. That's why, despite the tough rhetoric, the Biden administration has been extremely cautious about escalating. Because the last thing Washington wants is a real conflict in its own backyard, one that could drag in Russia, China, and Iran. But here's where the domestic politics come into play, and why this situation is even more volatile than it appears. The domestic political how U.S. elections are distorting strategy. Let's be the Biden administration's Venezuela policy is a mess. And it's not just because of geopolitical realities, it's because of American politics. Florida is the most important swing state in the 2024 election. And Florida's Cuban and Venezuelan exile communities hate Maduro. They want regime change. They want sanctions. They want the U.S. to take a hard line. And both Biden and Trump are desperate to win their votes. This creates a perverse incentive. The White House knows that easing sanctions on Venezuela would stabilize oil markets and reduce migration pressures. But it also knows that doing so would infuriate Florida's Latino voters. So instead, it's stuck in a cycle of half-easing sanctions just enough to keep oil flowing, but not enough to alienate the base. The Cibalo incident played right into this dynamic. The Pentagon's tough response wasn't just about deterrence, it was about political signaling. By framing Venezuela as a threat, the administration can justify keeping sanctions in place while also looking tough on national security. But here's this approach is unsustainable. Because every time the U.S. tightens the screws on Venezuela, Maduro turns to Russia and China for support. And every time Russia and China increase their presence in the Caribbean, the U.S. is forced to respond with more military posturing, which only reinforces the cycle. And that brings us to the real miscalculation. Scenario how this could play out. Let's game this out. Here are the 3 most likely scenarios and their probabilities. Scenario 1, controlled escalation. In this scenario, the U.S. and Venezuela engage in a tit-for-tat series of provocations, but neither side crosses the threshold into open conflict. The U.S. imposes targeted sanctions on Venezuelan military officials. Venezuela responds by expelling U.S. diplomats. Russia sends another submarine to the Caribbean. The U.S. conducts more naval exercises. And so on. This is the most likely outcome, but it's also the most dangerous, because it normalizes brinkmanship. Each side gets used to pushing the limits, and the risk of a mistake grows. A miscommunication. A misfired missile. A collision at sea. And suddenly, we're in a crisis. Scenario 2, limited U.S. military action. Here, the U.S. decides to restore deterrence with a limited strike, perhaps targeting a Venezuelan military base, or a Russian-supplied radar installation. The goal wouldn't be regime change, but to send a message. But here's the Venezuela isn't Iraq. It has allies. Russia could respond by increasing its military presence in Cuba. China could accelerate its port projects in AMA. Iran could activate sleeper cells in Latin America. And suddenly, the U.S. is facing a multi-front crisis in its own hemisphere. This scenario is plausible because it's exactly what the hawks in Washington want. But it's also reckless, because it assumes that Russia and China will back down, which they won't. Scenario 3, Great Power Confrontation. This is the nightmare scenario.
A Venezuelan or Russian submarine accidentally collides with a U.S. destroyer. A U.S. airstrike hits a Russian military advisor. Russia retaliates by sinking a U.S. ship. And suddenly, we're in a direct U.S.-Russia conflict in the Caribbean. This is the least likely scenario, but it's also the most catastrophic. Because once the shooting starts, there's no guarantee it stays limited. Russia could launch cyber attacks on U.S. infrastructure. China could move on Taiwan. And before we know it, we're in a global war. Now, I'm not saying this is inevitable. But I am saying that the conditions for it are being created right now by a combination of geopolitical rivalry, domestic political pressures, and sheer strategic incompetence. And that brings me to the real what the hell is the US trying to achieve here? Grand strategy: the folly of liberal hegemony. Let me tell you something that most Washington policymakers don't want. The US is trying to maintain a global empire it can no longer afford. For the past 30 years, the US has operated under the doctrine of liberal hegemony, the idea that America should use its military and economic power to shape the world in its own image. Democracy promotion. Regime change. Military interventions. The rules-based international order. And it's been a disaster. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Ukraine. Every time the US tries to fix a country, it ends up making things worse. And yet, the foreign policy establishment keeps doubling down, as if the next intervention will be the one that finally works. Venezuela is just the latest example. The US has spent decades trying to overthrow Maduro through sanctions, coups, and covert operations. And what's the result? A country in ruins. A refugee crisis that's destabilizing the region. And a government that's now more aligned with Russia and China than ever before. This isn't strategy. It's hubris. The US is like a boxer who keeps throwing punches long after he's exhausted himself. And now, his opponents are starting to counterpunch. Russia and China aren't trying to replace the US as the global hegemon. They're trying to erode American dominance by creating a multipolar world, one where the US no longer gets to dictate the rules. And they're doing it smartly, not through direct confrontation, but through asymmetric challenges: submarines in the Caribbean, port deals in AMA, cyber attacks, economic coercion. And the US? It's still trying to fight the last war. It's still obsessed with credibility and resolve. It's still acting like it's 1999, when it could invade a country and face no consequences. But we're not in 1999 anymore. We're in 2024. And the world has changed. Alternatives and what the US should do instead. So what should the US do? Here's the controversial: it should stop trying to overthrow Maduro. I know. That sounds like heresy in Washington. The foreign policy blob, those same people who brought us the Iraq War and Libya's collapse, will tell you that backing down now would be a sign of weakness. That if we don't stand firm, Russia and China will see it as an invitation to push further. That Maduro is a dictator who must go, no matter the cost. But here's the uncomfortable: the US has already lost in Venezuela. Not because Maduro is strong, he's not, but because the strategy was never about Venezuela in the first place. It was about signaling to the world that America still calls the shots. And that's the problem. We're so obsessed with maintaining the illusion of control that we're willing to burn down entire countries to preserve it. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about a fundamental shift in how power works in the 21st century. The US Navy's carrier strike groups were once the undisputed kings of the seas. They could project power anywhere, anytime, with impunity. But that era is ending. The rise of anti-access/area denial systems, like China's DF-21D carrier killer missiles or Russia's hypersonic Kinzhal, means that even a single submarine getting too close to a carrier isn't just a provocation. It's a demonstration that the old rules no longer apply. Let me explain why this matters. The US has 11 aircraft carriers. China has 3. Russia has 1. On paper, that looks like overwhelming American dominance.
But here's those carriers are increasingly vulnerable. In 2020, the Pentagon's own wargames showed that in a conflict with China, the US could lose 2 carriers in the first week. 2. That's not just a military setback, that's a geopolitical earthquake. Because if the world sees that the US can't protect its most iconic symbols of power, then the entire edifice of American hegemony starts to crumble. And that's exactly what Russia and China are betting on. They're not trying to match the US ship for ship or plane for plane. They're playing a different game, one where they don't need to win a direct confrontation. They just need to make it too costly for the US to keep playing the role of global policeman. Venezuela's submarine stunt? That's not just about Venezuela. It's about showing that even in America's backyard, the rules have changed. Here's another uncomfortable: the US is still fighting the Cold War in its head. We're so fixated on the idea of great power competition that we're missing the bigger picture. Russia and China aren't trying to build a new world order. They're trying to create a world where no single power, especially not the US, can dictate the rules. And they're doing it by exploiting its overstretched military, its polarized politics, its economic dependence on debt and financial dominance. Take sanctions, for example. The US has weaponized the dollar like never before, using it to punish adversaries from Iran to Russia. But every time we do that, we're pushing those countries to find alternatives. China is already settling more trade in yuan. Russia is using the ruble and the yuan for energy deals. Even Venezuela, under Maduro, has started selling oil in currencies other than the dollar. This isn't just about economics. It's about eroding the foundation of American power. Because if the dollar loses its dominance, the US loses its ability to project power globally. And that brings me back to Venezuela. The US has spent years trying to strangle Maduro's regime with sanctions, only to see him turn to Russia and China for survival. In 2019, Russia sent military advisors and Wagner Group mercenaries to prop up Maduro. China has poured billions into Venezuela's oil sector, securing long-term supply deals. And now, with this submarine incident, we're seeing the next direct challenge to US military dominance in the region. So what should the US do? First, it needs to accept that regime change in Venezuela isn't happening. Not through sanctions, not through covert ops, not through wishful thinking. Maduro isn't going anywhere, and the longer we pretend he will, the more we look weak and delusional. Second, we need to stop treating every challenge as an existential threat. A Venezuelan submarine getting too close to a carrier isn't Pearl Harbor. It's a reminder that the world has moved on, and we need to adapt. That means rethinking our military posture. The US can't afford to keep 800 bases around the world. It can't afford to treat every crisis as a test of credibility. And it certainly can't afford to keep pretending that it can dictate the behavior of every country on Earth. What we need is a strategy of restraint, one that focuses on protecting core American interests rather than policing the world. And here's the restraint: isn't weakness. It's realism. The US is still the most powerful country on Earth, but power isn't infinite. We can't keep spending trillions on wars and interventions while our infrastructure crumbles and our middle class shrinks. We can't keep acting like we're the world's policeman when the world no longer wants or needs one. The alternative isn't isolationism. It's selective engagement. It's recognizing that we can't fix every problem, but we can focus on the ones that actually matter. It's understanding that in a multipolar world, we don't have to be the sole superpower to remain secure. And it's accepting that sometimes, the best way to maintain influence is to stop trying to control everything. Because here's the more the US tries to hold on to its fading dominance, the faster it will lose it. Russia and China aren't stupid. They see our weaknesses, and they're exploiting them. The question is whether we'll keep doubling down on a strategy that's already failed, or whether we'll finally wake up and realize that the world has changed. And if we don't, the next time a submarine gets too close to a carrier, it might not be a Venezuelan diesel-electric boat. It might be a Chinese nuclear sub, armed with missiles that can sink it. And then, we'll have a real problem. Now, what most people don't realize is that this incident with Venezuela's submarine isn't just a foreign policy headache, it's a domestic political time bomb. And the way Washington handles it could either reinforce the illusion of American dominance or accelerate its decline in ways that will be felt at home long before they're acknowledged abroad.
Let me explain why this matters for the average American.
The U.S. defense budget is now pushing $900 billion a year, more than the next 10 countries combined, including China and Russia. Yet here we are, with a diesel-powered Venezuelan sub slipping past our carrier group like it was a training exercise. That's not just embarrassing, it's a flashing red warning that our military's edge isn't what it used to be. And when the public starts asking why we're spending more on defense than at the height of the Cold War while our adversaries are running circles around us in asymmetric ways, the political fallout won't be pretty. Here's the uncomfortable: the American people are tired of endless wars, but they're also deeply uncomfortable with the idea that their country might not be the undisputed global hegemon anymore.
That cognitive dissonance is the real battleground.
The Biden administration's response to this incident, whether they downplay it, overreact, or try to spin it, will tell us everything about how seriously they're taking the shift in global power dynamics.
Now, let's talk about the domestic political dimensions. The Venezuela sub-incident is a perfect storm for the 2024 election cycle.
On one side, you've got Republicans who will use this to argue that Biden is weak on national security, pointing to everything from the Afghanistan withdrawal to this latest humiliation. They'll trot out the usual suspects: Lindsey Graham, Tom Cotton, maybe even Trump if he's feeling particularly unhinged, to demand stronger responses that usually mean more military spending, more sanctions, or even direct confrontation. But here's where it gets interesting. The Republican establishment has spent decades selling the American people on the idea that military power equals security, and that any perceived weakness is an existential threat. Yet their own base is increasingly skeptical of foreign interventions. The same voters who cheered Trump's America First rhetoric are the ones who are now asking why we're still policing the world when our own borders are insecure and our cities are crumbling. This incident could actually backfire on the GOP if they overplay their hand.
On the Democratic side, the response is even more complicated.
The progressive wing of the party, figures like Bernie Sanders, AOC, and the Squad, have been pushing for years to rein in military spending and end forever wars. They'll see this incident as proof that the U.S. needs to stop acting like the world's policeman. But the establishment Democrats, the ones who still believe in the post-Cold War consensus, will be terrified of looking soft.
They'll try to thread the condemn Venezuela's actions, reassure allies, but avoid any real escalation that could spiral out of control.
The problem is, neither side has a coherent vision for what comes in. The Republicans want to double down on military dominance, even as the evidence mounts that it's not working. The Democrats are too divided between the progressives who want restraint and the centrists who still believe in the old playbook. And neither party is leveling with the American people about the reality of a multipolar world. Let me give you a concrete example of how this plays out. In 2019, when Iran shot down a U.S. drone, Trump ordered a retaliatory strike, then called it off at the last minute. The establishment freaked out, calling him weak. But the public? They were relieved. A Pew poll at the time showed that 61% of Americans opposed military action against Iran.
That's not isolationism, that's common sense.
The American people understand, even if the political class doesn't, that we can't keep treating every provocation as a casus belli.
Now, fast forward to today.
If the Biden administration responds to the Venezuela sub-incident with more sanctions, more military posturing, or God forbid, some kind of kinetic action, they'll be playing right into the hands of Maduro and his allies. Venezuela's economy is already in shambles, but Maduro has survived this long because he's mastered the art of turning U.S. pressure into a rallying cry for his base. Every time we impose new sanctions or threaten military action, we give him exactly what he in narrative of David versus Goliath, of Venezuela standing up to the imperialist Yankees.
Here's the Maduro doesn't care if Venezuela's economy collapses.
He cares about staying in power.
And right now, his biggest threat isn't the U.S. Navy, it's the Venezuelan people. The opposition, led by figures like Maria Corina Machado, has been gaining momentum, and the regime knows it. That's why Maduro is desperate to create external enemies.
It's a classic authoritarian: when things get bad at home, manufacture a crisis abroad to distract the population.
So what's the endgame here? Let's game out a few scenarios. First, the Biden administration could choose to downplay the incident. They could issue a stern statement, maybe impose some symbolic sanctions, and move on.
This would be the smartest move, but it's also the least likely. The political pressure to do something will be intense, especially with an election looming. The media will frame it as a test of Biden's strength, and the Republicans will pounce. So expect some kind of performative response, maybe a show of force in the Caribbean, or a new round of sanctions that will hurt ordinary Venezuelans more than the regime.
Second, the US could escalate.
They could send more ships to the region, conduct joint exercises with allies like Colombia or Brazil, or even authorize some kind of limited strike, say, against a Venezuelan naval base.
This would be a disaster. Venezuela's military is weak, but it's not non-existent. Maduro could respond by harassing US ships, or even targeting American interests in the region. And let's not forget that Venezuela has allies of its own. Russia has already sent military advisors to Caracas, and China has a vested interest in keeping Maduro in power as a counterbalance to US influence in Latin America. A US escalation could quickly spiral into a proxy conflict, with all the risks that entails. Third, the US could use this as an opportunity to rethink its entire approach to Latin America.
This is the scenario that gives me the most hope, but it's also the least likely. Instead of treating Venezuela as a rogue state that needs to be contained, the US could recognize that Maduro's regime is a symptom of a larger the failure of US policy in the region. For decades, the US has treated Latin America as its backyard, propping up dictators when it suited us and overthrowing them when it didn't. The result? A region that's increasingly turning to China and Russia for alternatives. What if, instead of doubling down on the same failed strategies, the US actually engaged with Latin America as a partner? What if we focused on economic development, trade, and diplomacy instead of military posturing? It's not a radical idea, it's just common sense.
But in Washington, common sense is in short supply. Let me give you a historical parallel.
In the 1930s, the US was obsessed with the threat of communism in Latin America. We backed dictators, overthrew governments, and generally made a mess of the region.
The result? A wave of anti-American sentiment that lasted for decades.
It wasn't until the 1990s, when the US started treating Latin America as a partner rather than a client, that relations began to improve. But then came the War on Terror, and we were right back to the old playbook.
The Venezuela sub-incident is a wake-up call. It's a reminder that the world has changed, and that the US can't keep acting like it's 1991.
The question is whether our political class is capable of adapting.
If they're not, then we're in for a rough ride. Because the next time a submarine gets too close to a carrier, it might not be a Venezuelan boat. It might be a Chinese one. And by then, it'll be too late to change course. Now, what most people don't realize is that this incident isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the broader collapse of US grand strategy in the Western Hemisphere. For decades, Washington has operated under the assumption that Latin America would remain a passive sphere of influence, a region where the US could dictate terms without serious pushback. But that assumption is dead, and the Venezuelan submarine is just the latest symptom of its demise. The real question isn't whether Maduro was trying to provoke the US, but whether the US even has a coherent strategy to respond beyond reflexive military posturing. Let me explain why this matters. The US has two fundamental problems in Latin America right now.
The first is that our traditional tools of influence, economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and covert regime change have not only failed but have actively pushed countries like Venezuela, Nicaragua, and even Bolivia into the arms of China and Russia. The second is that we've allowed our own domestic political dysfunction to blind us to the fact that the region is changing.
Latin America is no longer a collection of banana republics waiting for US approval.
It's a dynamic, increasingly assertive bloc with its own agency, and if we don't start treating it as such, we're going to wake up one day and find that we've lost the hemisphere without even realizing it.
Here's the uncomfortable: the US has no long-term strategy for Latin America because we've never really needed one.
For most of the 20th century, the Monroe Doctrine was enough. We could intervene when we wanted, ignore the region when we didn't, and assume that no one else would dare challenge us.
But that era is over.
China has invested over $160 billion in Latin America since 2005, according to the Inter-American Dialogue, and Russia has deepened its military and intelligence ties with Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba.
Meanwhile, the US has spent the last 2 decades obsessing over the Middle East, treating Latin America as an afterthought. The result? A region that's increasingly looking east for its future. So what should the US do? The first option is the one we're already doubled down on: military deterrence.
The Pentagon could increase patrols in the Caribbean, conduct more joint exercises with allies like Colombia and Brazil, and even consider a permanent naval presence near Venezuela.
But this is a losing game.
Military posturing without a broader diplomatic and economic strategy will only further alienate Latin American publics, who already view the US as an overbearing hegemon.
Remember the 2005 Summit of the Americas, when Latin American leaders openly mocked Bush's Free Trade Area of the Americas proposal?
That's the kind of pushback we can expect if we keep treating the region as a chessboard for great power competition. The second option is to recognize that containment has failed and pivot to engagement.
This doesn't mean embracing Maduro, far from it. But it does mean acknowledging that the US can't simply wish Venezuela's crisis away. We need a realistic, step-by-step plan to reintegrate Venezuela into the regional economy, one that includes sanctions relief in exchange for verifiable democratic reforms. It means working with allies like Mexico and Argentina to create a Latin American-led solution, rather than dictating terms from Washington. And it means investing in the region's future, not just through military aid, but through infrastructure, education, and trade. The Biden administration's America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity is a start, but it's not nearly ambitious enough. We need a Marshall Plan for Latin America, not another round of half measures. The third option is the most radical, but also the most. The US needs to accept that Latin America is no longer its exclusive sphere of influence. This doesn't mean surrendering to China or Russia, it means competing on a level playing field.
If Beijing is offering infrastructure loans without political strings attached, then the US needs to offer something: real partnerships, not just conditional aid. If Moscow is selling arms to Venezuela, then the US needs to ask why our allies in the region feel the need to look elsewhere for security.
The answer isn't more F-16s for Colombia, it's a fundamental rethink of how we engage with the hemisphere. Let me give you a concrete example.
In 2019, the Trump administration imposed sweeping sanctions on Venezuela, cutting off its oil exports to the US and pressuring allies to do the same.
The goal was to cripple Maduro's regime. The result? Venezuela's oil production collapsed, but Maduro didn't fall.
Instead, he turned to Iran for gasoline and to China and Russia for financial lifelines.
Meanwhile, ordinary Venezuelans suffered, and the country's crisis deepened. This is what happens when you treat economic warfare as a substitute for strategy. Sanctions are a tool, not a policy. If we're not careful, we'll end up with a Venezuela that's even more dependent on our adversaries and even more hostile to the US. Now, I know what some of you are, but what about democracy? What about human rights?
Those are valid concerns, and I'm not suggesting we abandon them.
But here's the thing: our current approach isn't advancing democracy or human rights. It's just making things worse.
The US has a long history of supporting dictators when it suits our interests: Pinochet in Chile, the Somozas in Nicaragua, the Shah in Iran, and then suddenly discovering the virtues of democracy when those dictators fall out of favor.
Latin Americans remember this history, and they're not wrong to be skeptical of our motives. The real test of US leadership isn't whether we can punish Venezuela, it's whether we can offer a better alternative. That means leading with diplomacy, not just military might.
It means investing in the region's future, not just its security. And it means accepting that the days of unchallenged US dominance in Latin America are over. The question is whether we're willing to adapt or whether we'll keep clinging to the past until it's too late.
Here's the bottom: the Venezuelan submarine incident is a warning shot. It's a reminder that the US can't afford to keep sleepwalking through Latin America.
If we don't change course, we're going to find ourselves in a hemisphere where our influence is marginal, our allies are few, and our adversaries are calling the shots. That's not a future any of us should want.
The good news is that it's not inevitable. The bad news is that time is running out.